The first 5 deals showed Canada's rise. The next 5 proved it wasn't a fluke. But these 5, they're the final blows that left the U.S. scrambling. Each deal wasn't just about numbers or headlines. They were calculated moves, backed by months of negotiations, and a clear shift in how Canada sees its place on the world stage. This year, Canada didn't just sign agreements, it changed the rules. From landmark partnerships with Europe to new infrastructure projects at home, every step sent a message. If you thought the last 2 videos were surprising, this one changes everything. Welcome to the finale. Canada's most calculated move this year was in energy, and it caught Washington flat-footed. Canada made headlines by launching its first export cargo from the massive LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia. This wasn't just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The Shell-led facility now ships natural gas directly to Asia, bypassing the old reliance on U.S. Gulf routes. For decades, American infrastructure controlled the flow of North American energy. Canada's new Pacific Gateway changes the map, giving Ottawa a direct line to global markets and breaking the old pattern where the U.S. had the final say. The LNG Canada project is no small feat. Billions invested, years of planning, and now tankers are loaded up and heading straight across the Pacific. Norway and the Netherlands didn't bankroll this one, but the international partnerships and technical expertise involved are a clear signal. Canada's not waiting for US approval anymore. The project taps into British Columbia's vast gas reserves and opens up new shipping lanes, putting Canadian energy on a world stage. That's not just an economic win, it's a shift in leverage. Canada can now negotiate with buyers in Asia on its own terms, and Washington can only watch as the old system gets rewritten. It's not just about the money, it's about control. For years, pipelines, refineries, and tankers all funneled through American oversight. Canada and the European Union signed a new agreement in Brussels, and it's more than just a handshake. The EU-Canada Security and Defence Partnership marks the first time the EU has formalized this kind of pact with a country from the Americas. It's not a biotech deal in the way the headlines would like, but it's a clear signal. Europe is looking for partners outside the US, and Canada is first in line. This partnership covers everything from defense procurement to digital trade, and it opens the door for deeper cooperation in sectors like biotechnology, critical raw materials, and even pandemic preparedness. Let's look at what this means. With the new framework, Canada gets a seat at the table for joint procurement and research initiatives that used to be dominated by American firms. The EU and Canada are now working together on aligning standards for clinical trials, sharing data, and securing supply chains, steps that make it easier for Canadian biotech companies to work directly with European counterparts. Quebec and Ontario, already known for their life sciences and manufacturing, stand to benefit the most. The partnership isn't about shutting out the US entirely, but it does mean that when Europe wants a reliable partner for sensitive projects, whether it's vaccine technology, diagnostics, or next-generation treatments, they're not automatically calling Washington. The deal also ties into broader cooperation on digital trade and cybersecurity. Canada and the EU agreed to start a digital trade agreement, which will let them share infrastructure, data, and research without needing US platforms or oversight. That's not just about convenience, it's about trust. After years of unpredictable US trade policy, Europe is looking for stability. Canada's reputation for steady supply chains and transparent governance made it the obvious choice. This shift isn't only about research labs and boardrooms, it's about leverage. During the last pandemic, Canada was at the mercy of US and European suppliers for vaccines and medical supplies. Now, with this new partnership, Canada has a bigger say in how those resources move. The US isn't being cut out entirely, but it's no longer the only gatekeeper. Europe and Canada are setting new rules, and American companies have to adjust. The balance of power is changing. Canada's role in global supply chains is growing, and the US is watching as old alliances get rewritten. But this isn't just about health or defense. The next move happens a lot closer to home, where Canada is working with its southern neighbor in a way that's got Washington paying attention. Canada's approach to North American trade logistics is changing, but not in the way most headlines suggest. There's no secret deal with Mexico to reroute exports through Canadian ports. Instead, the real story is about how Canada is working to reduce its own reliance on U.S. transit routes by focusing on internal reforms and infrastructure upgrades. The government's push to remove interprovincial trade barriers, highlighted by Bill C-5, the so-called One Canadian Economy Act, is at the center of the shift. For years, moving goods across provincial lines in Canada was harder than shipping them into the U.S. Now, with new legislation and a focus on streamlining customs and logistics, Canada is making it easier for goods to move east-west across the country without unnecessary red tape. This isn't just about paperwork. Canadian ports like Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Halifax are all seeing upgrades and expanded capacity, making them more competitive on the global stage. There's a push to modernize rail and highway corridors so goods from the prairies, Ontario, and Quebec reach the coast faster and at a lower cost. These investments are designed to make Canadian infrastructure a real alternative to U.S. routes, not just for domestic producers, but for international partners looking for a stable and efficient gateway to North America. The economic impact is already showing up. With fewer internal barriers and better logistics, Canadian businesses are saving time and money. Exporters aren't forced to rely on U.S. ports or customs systems, and that independence is starting to matter as global trade patterns shift. The U.S. isn't losing out on Mexican exports to Canada, but it is watching as Canada becomes more self-sufficient and attractive to foreign investors. That's a subtle but important change in the balance of power. It's not just about trucks, trains, and cargo ships. This new approach is about control, over supply chains, over security, and over the rules that define who gets access to what. As Canada builds out its own systems and strengthens ties with key partners, the old North American trade map looks less certain. The US can't take Canadian dependence for granted anymore. And while trade and logistics are shifting, Canada's next move is even more strategic. There's a new alliance forming, and this time, it's not about moving goods, it's about securing information. Canada is tightening its grip on digital security, and this time it's not relying on the US for backup. The focus shifted to cyber alliances, with Ottawa moving to expand its cooperation with trusted partners in Europe, especially the Nordic countries. There's no official Nordic Cyber Pact on the books, but the groundwork is clear. The EU-Canada Security and Defence Partnership, signed this year, set up new cyber consultations and information sharing channels that go far beyond what was in place before. These aren't just empty promises. Canada is now working with Sweden, Norway, and Finland on coordinated cyber threat assessments, capacity building, and the kind of joint response planning that used to be reserved for US-led coalitions. Here's how it works. Canada and its European partners exchange real-time data on cyber threats, track attacks on critical infrastructure, and coordinate diplomatic responses when they're targeted by hostile actors. The agreement's language is careful, but the intent is obvious. Create a high-trust network for cyber defense that isn't run out of Washington. This is about more than just sharing warnings. It's about developing common encryption protocols, sharing best practices for securing Arctic undersea cables, and making sure that if one country gets hit, the others know exactly how to respond. The US isn't in the loop the way it once was. Canada's cybersecurity agencies are already seeing the benefits. They're running joint exercises with Nordic teams, simulating attacks on power grids and telecom networks. They're also working on new encryption standards designed for the harsh conditions in the Arctic. where communications infrastructure is both crucial and vulnerable. The EU-Canada digital trade negotiations, launched in parallel, are setting up shared standards for data protection and digital commerce. That means less dependence on US platforms and more control over how Canadian and European data moves across borders. American officials have tried to downplay these moves, but the reality is hard to ignore. Canada is building a fortress around its digital borders, and it's picking its own partners. The message is simple: technical competence and mutual trust matter more than old alliances. This isn't a snub for the sake of it. It's a strategic shift, and it's working. But cyber isn't the only front where Canada is making moves the US can't match. There's another resource, one that's even more critical to the future of technology and global supply chains, where Canada just pulled off a deal that left Washington scrambling. Copper sits at the center of the global shift to clean technology, and Canada just made its most decisive move yet. The Canadian government, working off its 2022 critical minerals strategy, doubled down this year on securing copper supplies, not with a flashy buyout, but with a series of agreements that put Ottawa at the heart of the world's tech supply chains. Instead of chasing headlines with massive acquisitions, Canada built relationships with South American producers and EU partners, locking in long-term supply contracts and joint ventures that sidestep the old US-centric model. Copper isn't just a line item on a spreadsheet. It's the material that keeps electric vehicles running, powers AI data centers, and connects renewable energy to the grid. One EV needs over 180 pounds of copper. And the numbers keep climbing as more countries push for electrification. AI data centers are expanding, each one packed with copper wiring for high-speed data transfer and energy efficiency. The global demand for copper is projected to double in the next decade, but new mines are slow to come online, and established deposits are tightly controlled. Canada saw the writing on the wall. While US firms focused on lithium and rare earths, Canadian negotiators worked behind the scenes, offering better environmental standards, revenue sharing, and local job guarantees to win over South American mining ministries. The result is leverage. Canada now has preferential access to some of the world's most reliable copper streams, backed by formal cooperation with the EU on critical raw materials. These deals don't make for splashy headlines, but they matter. Tesla, GM, and Ford all need secure copper to meet production targets for EVs. Nvidia and Intel can't build the next generation of AI chips without it. Instead of being forced to buy from unstable suppliers or pay premiums to jump the line, these companies now have to factor Canadian contracts and priorities into every decision. Canada isn't just a middleman anymore, it's a gatekeeper. The US is left in a weaker position. American negotiators are scrambling for alternative sources, often in regions with higher political risk or lower grade ore. The old supply chain, where the US called the shots and everyone else followed, is breaking down. Canada's critical minerals strategy isn't just about economics, it's about power. Control the copper and you control the future of EVs, AI, and clean energy. That's what a real supply chain takedown looks like. Canada didn't just participate in the trade war, it rewrote the rules. Canada's recent moves aren't just headlines, they're a new playbook. LNG Canada's first export cargo, the EU-Canada Security and Defence Partnership opening up joint procurement, Bill C-5's push to break down interprovincial trade barriers, ongoing digital trade agreement negotiations, and the critical minerals dialogue with the EU all show Canada is thinking several steps ahead. Prime Minister Mark Carney says it's about diversifying and strengthening our international partnerships, and you can see that strategy in action. So which of these real deals caught you off guard? Let me know in the comments and hit subscribe to keep up with how global power shifts. This is just the start.